at Dell.com.
7:39. Team Hochberg Traffic Center time is a service of Turnkey.pro. Turnkey will fully protect your network with up-to-date cyber protection, unlimited backup, unlimited 24/7 help desk support, and real-time threat hunting for less than the price of a monthly car payment. Protect your small business today. Visit turnkey.pro today. Inbound Edens at 36 Lake Cook Road into the junction. A manageable 90 minutes right now. O'Hare into the Burns Circle interchange. Change your solid all the way in. Kennedy outbound stop and go. Ogden to the Edens junction. Ike on the inbound side, 90 minutes from 390 into the old post office. Stevenson at 1 hour from the Tri-State into DuSable Lakeshore Drive. Chicago's Morning Answer continues next. AM 560 Weather Center forecast. Sunny to partly cloudy and warm, high 79. Partly cloudy and mild, low 64. Partly cloudy and 60 right now. Your next news update is at 8. Chicago's Morning Answer continues next on AM 560 The Answer.
Now, from the Signature Bank Studios.
Only the biggest stories, only the biggest guests, and only the biggest opinions. This is AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy at a address to farmers in Pennsylvania. Trump had this to say, going to the tariff policy choice yet again, warning to John Deere, who is looking to move operations down to Mexico.
I just noticed behind me John Deere tractors. I know a lot about John Deere. I love the company. But as you know, they've announced a few days ago that they're going to move a lot of their manufacturing business to Mexico. I'm just notifying John Deere right now. If you do that, we're putting a 200% tariff on everything that you want to sell into the United States, so that if I win, John Deere is going to be paying a 200%. They haven't started it yet. Maybe they haven't even made the final decision yet, but I think they have. John Deere is going to, and anybody else that does this, because it's hurting our farmers, it's hurting our manufacturing. And if you do that, you're going to have a 200% tariff put on the product that you make in Mexico, right across the border. They think they're going to make product cheaper in Mexico and then sell it in for the same prices they did before, make a lot of money by getting rid of our labor and our jobs, and really a great name, because John Deere's a great name.
Well, that may be music to the ears of some. Trump with tariffs is sort of like the hammer and the nail parable, right? The hammer sees every problem as a nail to be pounded down. He goes to the tariff policy choice to try to institute corporate discipline in staying onshore or onshoring. But these sectors are a little bit more complicated than just taxing goods produced in countries other than America. It seems to me it's pretty simplistic neo-mercantilism. Now, it doesn't hang me up on Trump. I've been, I just don't come from the same place he does in terms of economic theory, but
Mitch McConnell shredded him yesterday about this tariff plan, saying that that's just going to raise the prices for American consumers.
Well, Mitch McConnell is a kleptocrat, so I don't really have much use for Mitch McConnell and his economic analysis either, because he's a promulgator of counterproductive rent-seeking behavior. So the problem is very few people, if any, come to very few, maybe a few, but very few come to the table with clean hands on these issues of playing favorites with government policy, using government policy as a sword or a shield, depending on your particular interests. I'm not flacking for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce here either. I don't like rent-seeking behavior. But is this a way to address a problem that is highlighted in a new book by Brian Reisinger, The Disappearance of American Farms? Brian Reisinger is a former spokesman for U.S. Senators Lamar Alexander and Ron Johnson, as well as former Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker. He's an award-winning author of the recently released book, Land Rich, Cash Poor, My Family's Hope and the Untold Story of the Disappearing American Farmer. Brian Reisinger, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, Dan. Hey, Amy. Thanks for having me.
So, what Trump said about John Deere's sending one across the bow there, is that music to your ears?
Yeah, well, I think we all hope, or at least a lot of us hope, that there's a way that we can focus on onshoring jobs, bringing back Midwestern manufacturing, working with good companies like John Deere, and also there's a way to avoid increasing costs on people, not only John Deere, but also on those farmers who buy that machinery and who buy those machine parts. So, I never know quite how to predict where things are going to go when Donald Trump throws something like that out there, how a company is going to behave. There's a lot of ifs there. My hope is, and I think there's ways to do this. We found this in the book. My hope is that there's ways to get tough on trade and have, flow of goods happening in a low-cost way in this economy. And so that's kind of my hope because, the reality is, he is speaking of things that people are upset about, but also, to your point, some of these solutions can have unintended consequences. That's something we got to make sure we get right.
When you talk about, in your book, 45,000 farms lost annually for the past century. Now, is that farmland that's actually converted to something else, or are we just seeing what has been reported widely, which is the consolidation of family farms into mega farms?
It's a great question. With the book, I decided I wanted to try to get down into that layer beneath the surface. What's that story beneath the surface that nobody's heard about? Why we're losing farms decade after decade. And what we've seen is that loss of 45,000 farms annually falls in a couple different categories. One is farms just wiped out. Home states like mine in Wisconsin went from number one in milk production to number one in farm bankruptcies. So that's families losing everything, and that sometimes just goes completely by the wayside. You end up having some farms that end up sitting idle. You have other farmland that is bought up by other farms. That's true. You also have farmland that's lost to development, and that means that farm families, some of them, if they live near a metro area or near enough or area where someone wants to move to, they can sell their land for a decent amount of money. But here's the deal. They want to hold on to that land, and holding on to it, they can't make a living anymore. They're grinding out that living harder and harder each year. Or you can turn around and sell the land, and then you lose everything else because a farm isn't just your job. It's your home, your community, your heritage, So there's a lot of things happening in this farmland, but in some cases they just disappear to development. In other cases, it's a family ruined and one farm combining with another.
What happened to your family's farm?
Well, I appreciate you asking that. We're still holding on, thankfully, but we've had some very close calls over the year. Part of what we do in the book is we talk about the economic story, what's going on driving this issue, but I weave that with my family story. So we've had a lot of close calls over the past century. Right now, what we're doing is we're doing diversified farming. We're still raising dairy cows for other herds. We're also raising beef cattle for consumers and raising cash crops. We're figuring out a way to make that work. My dad is still farming. My sister's working to take over the farm from him. But we did have to make some changes. Now, in 2021, we sold our dairy herd and stopped milking cows and started doing this diversified farming. Boy, when you sell that dairy herd, it's like a death in the family. And that was a really hard thing, and it's a scary thing economically, too.
I mean, how much of this is federal versus state policy? For example, you're talking about being land rich and cash poor. I totally get that. And you have states like Indiana, which of course agribusiness is big, where you have hard caps on property taxes. It's 1% on residential, 2% on I think it's 2% on farm rural, and then 3% on commercial or something like that. Anyway, hard caps so that your costs to maintain your land are predictable, unlike a state, for example, like Illinois. So I just wonder, in terms of when you think about policy that would protect the family farmer without getting into this endless business of subsidies and competition restrictions and so forth, is it really more sensible policy at the state level or the federal level?
I'll tell you, there's more that can be done at both levels because of the depth of this issue. When you have a problem that has set in over the course of a century, there's a lot that needs to be done to address it. Wisconsin overall does pretty good on farm policy. To your point on keeping taxes low, regulations from being too expensive, things like that. Farmland in Wisconsin is taxed in the way that the property value is determined based on what you can grow there as opposed to what it could be worth from development. So you don't have your property tax values going through the roof and paying higher and higher property taxes just because more people want to buy your land. You're being taxed for what it's actually used for, which is growing crops. So that's a smart way to make sure that's actually accurate for the farmer and that you don't have these guys just paying property tax bills are through the roof. So there's things like that in Wisconsin. There's more that we need to do to create more entrepreneurial opportunity in our rural communities, and that's something that local, state, and federal can all do. Now, as you know, federal is a mess, right? I talked to one economist who described federal farm policy like a Jenga tower. We've been building one program on top of another on top of another. You can argue about whether one had a good purpose or not. We can have that debate. But now they're piled up on top of each other, and they're going to topple, and it's hard to figure out what to do with which block.
Well, right. And at the federal level, I love this joke, by the way, the old Department of Agriculture joke. Farmer walks into the Department of Agriculture. He sees a clerk on his desk with his head down crying. And he says to the clerk, what's wrong? Why are you so upset? And the clerk picks up his head and he says, my farmer died. And so you're right. So the federal.
You love that joke.
It's a great joke.
I mean, I've heard it before.
It's illustrative, and so maybe the point about funding a bureaucracy, not really providing policies that are sort of directly beneficial long term for farmers, even though the subsidies are sacrosanct.
Yeah. Well, I love that joke. If you don't mind me using it, and whether it's a farmer died like a pet or a goldfish, or whether it's being treated like zoo animals, the reality is the federal government really doesn't understand what's going on with the farmer.
Well, who's failed the American farmers more, the Democrats or the Republicans?
That's such a good question, and I got to shoot straight about that. The reality is that, the establishment GOP as well as Democrats over the decades and their positions on things and who they're fighting for can change over such a long period of time, so I acknowledge that. But the reality is that over the decades, it's been both. We've had Democrats who instituted a lot of the government intervention in the first place that ended up being prone to abuse and favoritism, whether it was, designed properly and well-intentioned in the beginning. And then we've had Republicans who have really failed economic policy that's more focused on the market, but failed to make sure that economic policy allows small businesses to have a fighting chance, not only farms, but others. And so there's been all kinds of problems. The best example, I'll tell you real briefly, is the farm crisis in the 1980s. My parents survived the farm crisis in the 1980s. They were dealing with a drought. They were newlyweds. There was all kinds of problems, and that was before the government got involved. What happened with the farm crisis in the 80s is a lot of people probably remember the government both parties had been encouraging farmers to get bigger or get out for a long time by then, including with debt that was fueled by government programs. Again, you can talk about whether each program ought to be there or not, but the reality is that it fueled that growth in debt. And then the government, in trying to control inflation, increased those interest rates. Again, that might be something you can argue for. But when you do those two things together, you have the government telling farmers, hey, take out this debt, and then you have the government snapping their fingers and making that debt more expensive. That kicks off a rural financial crisis, and it was caused by the government. And so those are the kinds of things that farmers have been dealing with from both parties.
Well, that's the problem, is the moral hazards that the government creates and the perverse incentives that they present. And so this is why my philosophical preference is to get out of the price supports business altogether and have the farmers basically lead the way by saying, just get out of our way already, because you also have, just as another example, but get your comment on it. It seems to me perverse incentives, another illustration of perverse incentives, like you were discussing during the farm aid era, if you will, is the windmills and destroying farmland because you get paid so much in federal and state subsidies to put these gargantuan windmills that are a lot of them are going to turn out to be white elephants on farmland.
Well, there's all kinds of things that individual landowners have got to be able to decide what to do. And, the reality is, too, when you zoom out into our entire ag sector, and it reflects a lot of what you see in our entire economy, we have subsidy programs that they're not just doing the baseline of what they're supposed to do, where they're supposed to guard against, like, uncontrollable weather factors and things like that. Maybe some things where you could argue, reasonable people could say, okay, well, we need to have some baseline for the stability of our food supply, and so that a farmer doesn't, have a major weather event just destroy his entire year's income. There might be a place for that discussion, but the reality is that what we have subsidies that do all kinds of things. We have subsidies that make sure that farmers stay locked into just growing certain types of commodity corn.
Paid not to grow. Famously paid not to grow in some circumstances.
Or not to grow, as opposed to pursuing that entrepreneurial opportunity where it's like, hey, I can raise some corn and soybeans because that's good on the world commodity markets. I'm also going to put in some specialty wheat or some artisan tomatoes over here because I got people who I know will buy that. That's not really something that farmers are able to do because they're kind of locked into chasing that dollar,
Brian Reisinger is former spokesman for U.S. Senators Lamar Alexander and Ron Johnson, as well as Governor Scott Walker, as he mentioned, family farm in Wisconsin. his recently released book, Land Rich, Cash Poor. Land Rich, Cash Poor, My Family's Hope and the Untold Story of the Disappearing American Farmer. Brian, thanks so much for joining us. Good luck with the book.
Hey, I appreciate it. People can find it on Amazon or ask your local bookstore for it. I hope that just people get the word out on these issues and we can see if we can change things.
All right. Thanks, Brian. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
This is Chicago's Morning Answer.
Your show keeps me alive during the week. There's nobody I'd rather listen to between 5 and 9 in the morning than you guys.
On AM 560, The Answer.
Sheet metal is